Hey guys, tonight we slip through time into the dusty alleys of ancient cities, where the scent of spice barely covers the stench of sweat. You stand barefoot in the middle of a bustling market square. There's shouting in Arabic, Turkish, and Persian. Merchants wave swaths of cloth and shout out the quality of their goods. Only some of those goods are people, tethered with ropes, eyes downcast, skin marked with heat and shame. You're in a slave market under the Islamic Caliphates, and yeah, you probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop your location and what time it is where you're listening. Some of you are night owls, I know. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge slowly past rows of bodies, dark, light, male, female, young, and heartbreakingly young. Some are bound with iron shackles, others display wooden tags listing their age, health, and what they're best used for. Cooking, field labour, personal service, light domestic entertainment, a tag says, and your brain politely skips decoding that one. In the golden age of the Islamic Caliphates, slavery wasn't a fringe horror. It was woven into everyday life, normalised, ritualised, and institutionalised. And unlike chattel slavery in the Atlantic world, slavery here wasn't always lifelong or hereditary. But that didn't make it humane. You watch as a merchant tests a boy's teeth, like he's buying a mule. Nearby, a man in fine robes haggles over a woman's price as if negotiating for a carpet. The girl doesn't look up. Neither does the boy. Mainstream history likes to highlight Islamic civilization's contributions: algebra, astronomy, libraries, the House of Wisdom. Fair enough. But walk around long enough in these markets, and you'll see a darker ledger running parallel. One of human lives turned into economic units. This isn't just Baghdad. Cairo, Damascus, Fez, Samarkand. They all had designated slave markets. In some, Friday mornings were the peak selling time, just after prayer. Kind of kills the spiritual vibe, doesn't it? Now, not all slaves were captured in war. Many were bred for this purpose, children of slaves who were never legally acknowledged by their owners. Others were kidnapped in raids from as far away as Eastern Europe, Sub-Saharan Africa, and even the Indian subcontinent. Some were sold by their own families under crushing taxes or drought-driven desperation. The fringe tidbit. In some markets, slaves were arranged by skin colour and region like fruit in a produce aisle. Black African slaves were labelled for manual labour. Slavic or Circassian ones were marketed as prettier, and thus more suitable for household or harem work. It was racist, structured, and chillingly specific. Historians still argue whether the Caliphates saw slavery as an unchangeable institution or a transitional social role that could lead to freedom. There were laws about kind treatment, limits on abuse, and formal routes to manumission. But how many of those rules were followed when nobody was watching? You hear a whisper, someone trying to buy a pregnant woman. She's more valuable because the child can be born into slavery, raising the investment's future yield. The man who whispers, he's not even hiding. This is just business. One man calls himself a slave specialist. You don't want to know what that means. But you glance over and see that he's got detailed ledgers. Ages, prices, conditions, even resale margins. If Excel had existed back then, he would have been a master of spreadsheets. Congrats, I guess. And here's a cruel irony. Islamic scripture, including the Quran and Hadiths, has numerous passages urging the freeing of slaves as a righteous act. But instead of ending slavery, that teaching became a loophole. Rich men would buy and free a slave as a way of earning spiritual merit, and then just buy another one the next day. It's like donating to charity with a coupon code. You take a few more steps through this chaotic nightmare. The noise is overwhelming. The heat is relentless. And in all this movement, the only still things are the slaves. No one dares speak out, scream, or even cry. You start to feel like you're the only one who notices them as people. A boy meets your eyes, just for a second. That tiny flicker, that trace of soul still resisting collapse. And it hits you. This isn't ancient history. This is right now, in their time. You're not in the past, they are in their own present. This was their life, while philosophers debated metaphysics just a few streets away. There's a man with a trained parrot sitting on his shoulder. He uses it to attract children who might fetch a good price. Look. The bird talks. He yells, then tosses the kid an apple before guiding him toward a tented stall. You realise what's happening only after the child vanishes behind the curtain. You try to leave the market, but it loops in on itself. A nightmare maze of transaction and silence. You hear languages you don't recognise. You see contracts being written in perfect calligraphy for the transfer of a child, like it's an art piece. One seller offers a buy 6, get 1 free deal. You think he's joking until a robed buyer accepts. In the centre of the square, there's a raised platform. A girl stands alone, barefoot, thin, trembling. The auctioneer calls her educated in Persian poetry, which, apparently, makes her a premium offering. You imagine her reciting Rumi under the flicker of torchlight, hoping someone kind might hear. But kindness is in short supply here. Then there's you, still watching, still walking, still trying to wrap your head around how a society known for science and beauty could cradle such cruelty right at its heart. But don't get too comfortable. We're only just getting started. You step away from the market, but the echoes stick, shouting, bartering, and the shuffle of bare feet on hot stone. You follow a shaded corridor into the heart of Baghdad's golden age, slipping past palace guards in embroidered vests and jewel-hilted swords. What greets you isn't just wealth. It's opulence so saturated it almost burns. Welcome to the Abbasid Caliphate, and welcome to Harun al-Rashid's court. Everything gleams. Gold-trimmed mosaics catch the candlelight. Incense curls through the air, thick as velvet. And in every corner, men and boys stand still, silent, watchful, motionless. You think they're statues at first, but then one blinks. These are eunuchs. Boys taken from their homes, mutilated in the name of service, and brought here not to live, but to orbit power. You notice how the court moves around them, not with them. They serve drinks, guard royal chambers, deliver messages, even manage the harem. They're the machinery behind the fantasy, always there, never acknowledged. You watch one man, slender, shoulders stooped from decades of submission, carefully pour a goblet of wine with a precision that could rival surgery. He doesn't speak. Most don't. Their silence isn't just obedience, it's survival. The process to become a eunuch wasn't just horrifying, it was deadly. Castration wasn't a sterile surgical affair. It was done quickly, often with crude tools, and without anaesthetic. The survival rate? Grim. But if you lived, you were valuable. The logic was twisted. No genitals, no sexual threat. No family ties, no split loyalties. Just total devotion to the court. One fringe historian claimed some eunuchs even paid for the procedure voluntarily, chasing upward mobility. Historians still argue whether that's true or just apologist nonsense. What we do know, most of these boys didn't volunteer. Many were from Africa, others from Byzantine or Slavic territories, captured in raids or handed over as tribute. Once inside the palace, they were refined, trained in etiquette, languages, and sometimes poetry, math, or calligraphy. Not because anyone wanted them to flourish, but because an obedient, useful eunuch was worth more than a broken one. One eunuch, a man named Badr al-Mu'tadidi, actually rose to become a powerful general and vizier. That's rare. Most faded into the folds of history, nameless and forgotten, living ghosts inside golden halls. You trail a group now, weaving through corridors behind veils and privacy screens. They're headed to the harem. Not for pleasure, they're not allowed that. Their job is to guard, fetch, relay orders. The women trust them only because they have no choice. The harem itself is like another world, perfumed, ornate, and stifling. A concubine in a sea-green dress laughs too loudly, clutching a pomegranate. She's trying too hard to seem carefree. You feel the tension between her and the eunuch standing nearby. They both know too much. Neither has anywhere to go. You catch snippets of gossip about a prince's new obsession, about a concubine who vanished after angering a sultan, about a eunuch who knew too much and was reassigned, which, here, is code for disposed of quietly. Sevens. There's a smell of roasted lamb and figs in honey. It makes your stomach turn. You've seen too much. Outside, the public sees the palace as a miracle of civilization. The Caliphate's wealth and culture dazzle the world. But you know better now. You've walked the service halls. You've seen who bleeds to keep the wall standing. One curious detail. Eunuchs often carried ceremonial staffs, not weapons, just symbols of their rank. You spot one now, intricately carved, tucked under an elbow like a cane. It's a badge of authority, but also a reminder of what they've lost. One eunuch passes you slowly, and you meet his eyes for a moment. There's a flicker, like he remembers a different life. A mother. A name. A boy who used to run barefoot in the fields before men came with silver and rope. But the look vanishes, replaced by the cold mask of duty. Another man, plump and red-cheeked, tells a joke to a caliph's guest about how you can trust a eunuch more than your own son. Laughter follows. You don't laugh. They joke because they can't bear the silence. You stay quiet because you're starting to understand what silence costs. Historians point out that many caliphates had codes about treating slaves and eunuchs with dignity. But here's the thing. Laws on paper don't feel like comfort when you're holding a torch outside a locked door while a woman screams behind it. Sometimes, a eunuch gained influence, trusted by the caliph, managing affairs of state, even brokering royal marriages. But power without autonomy is just a longer leash. In some cases, eunuchs were the kingmakers, behind-the-scenes puppeteers whispering into the ears of rulers. But history rarely remembers them by name. Except maybe for Nasr al-Khazin, a eunuch who managed the treasury and basically ran the caliphate's economic system for decades. Kind of the CFO of Baghdad, if you want to picture it that way. Not bad for a man with no legal status as a full person. You drift to the palace edge, where the scent of jasmine mixes with the harsh desert wind. The eunuch kneels beside a fountain, washing a silver tray. He's humming, just a few notes of a tune from somewhere else. Somewhere he once knew. You listen. You wonder. And for a second, you forget where you are. But then a bell chimes. Another eunuch stands. Another tray is filled. Another curtain draws closed. And the machinery of empire whirs quietly back into motion. You wake up, or maybe you never slept, and you're already moving. The palace is far behind now, fading like a mirage. Before you, a training ground unfolds beneath the blazing sun. Dust rises with every footfall. The clash of metal on metal cuts through the air. No, this isn't a gladiator arena. It's a military academy. And every soldier here, a slave. These are the Mamluks. Child slaves stripped of names, languages, families, then rebuilt as elite warriors. You walk among them now, past boys barely into their teens who move with the discipline of seasoned killers. Their eyes are hard, their movements sharp. Not a trace of childhood left. Born in bondage, bred for war, someone whispers beside you. It's not a metaphor, it's policy. The Mamluk system started when Islamic rulers realized they could shape military loyalty from scratch. Why rely on tribal allegiances or moody noblemen when you could buy young boys, convert them to Islam, train them in isolation, and make them utterly loyal to the state? Loyalty with no lineage to challenge yours. Genius and horrifying. You pass a training circle. A boy is knocked flat by his partner, hard. He doesn't cry. He doesn't dare. He just gets up, steadies his stance, and waits for the signal to begin again. Most of these boys were captured from the Caucasus, Central Asia, or the Balkans. Circassians, Georgians, Kipchaks. Their parents might have handed them over under duress, or they were raided from their villages in the middle of the night. Some were bought outright in sprawling markets. Doesn't matter. Once you entered the Mamluk system, your old life vanished. And here's the paradox. They were slaves, but not in chains. They were given fine training, top-tier gear, and even stipends. They could rise to high rank. Some eventually ruled entire sultanates, but they were always property first, men second. You watch a commander inspect a row of recruits. He slaps one across the face, not in anger, just habit. The boy doesn't flinch. That's exactly what the commander wants. One fringe tidbit. Mamluks had incredibly strict grooming codes. Beards trimmed to uniform length. Fingernails checked weekly. There were rules about everything: how to eat, walk, fight, pray. Discipline wasn't encouraged. It was surgically enforced. You sit beneath a date palm for a moment and watch the boys drill with swords heavier than you'd expect. It's hard not to notice how quiet it is. No chatter. No laughter. Just orders barked in Turkish and Arabic, followed by precise execution. Historians still argue whether Mamluks were slaves in the traditional sense. They weren't shackled. They weren't bought and sold after training. Some even married and owned property. But their freedom was conditional, and their origin was always remembered. No matter how high a Mamluk rose, he was never considered a full member of the elite class. Just a useful exception. You trail behind a group now jogging toward the stables. Horses whinny at the scent of sweat and metal. One boy slips, and instantly he's pulled aside. Not punished. Removed. You never see him again. A senior officer nods toward a mural of battlefield glory, Mamluks on horseback, trampling enemies, flags raised high. The propaganda works. Some boys stare at it like it's a holy image. This isn't just survival. It's internalized pride. And here's the creepy part. This system worked. Mamluks became the backbone of Islamic military might. They were instrumental in halting the Mongols at Ain Jalut. They crushed crusaders. They even founded the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt and ruled independently for centuries. Imagine a society where slaves become rulers, but only as long as they produce more slaves like themselves. You peek into a dormitory. The bunks are lined in perfect rows. No personal items. No toys. Just folded uniforms and sharpened knives. One boy reads a Quranic verse under his breath, rocking slightly. It's unclear whether he's praying or trying to calm himself. Food arrives. Simple gruel, some figs, a slab of dry bread. The boys eat without talking. You're reminded of a monastery, if monks trained with scimitars. One commander strides past and throws a gold coin at a boy who landed 3 perfect strikes. Reward and reinforcement. Just like training a horse or a hawk. But the real punch? Some of these boys, these once-bought bodies, grew up to become sultans. Real ones. With thrones, armies, and all the swagger that comes with it. Like Kalawun or Baybars, their rule was marked by cunning and cruelty. It's as if they never stopped being soldiers, even on the throne. Still, many didn't survive long enough to wear armour, let alone crowns. Training accidents, disease, or, more often, political purges. A Mamluk was disposable if he didn't fit the machine. You cross a courtyard where horses are being broken in. A boy is thrown from a stallion, scrapes his face, but doesn't yelp. Pain is processed silently here. No one helps him. He gets up alone. And somewhere in all this brutality, you realise something awful. Some of the boys believed in this. They internalised the myth that being a Mamluk was better than being a poor villager or a farmer's son. At least here, You had a purpose, a sword, a path. That's the final cruelty, when a slave no longer dreams of freedom, only rank. The sun dips low. Training ends. The boys shuffle into prayer lines, robotic but reverent. The call to prayer echoes across the field. It's beautiful, almost peaceful. But you know what it masks. Tomorrow they'll rise again. Tomorrow they'll train harder. Tomorrow, one of them might die, and no one will stop to mourn. You step away slowly, your ears ringing with the memory of steel clashing and boys not screaming. You won't forget this. The dust of the training field still clings to your sandals as you walk a quieter path now, one that winds behind tall marble walls and passes whispering fountains. The air shifts, cooler, heavier with perfume. You're entering the private quarters of the elite, but not the kind with gold-threaded robes and jewelled turbans. This is the women's wing. The harem. You pass a threshold and immediately feel the temperature drop, not just the physical air, but the mood. Quiet, controlled, tense. This isn't a romantic fantasy out of storybooks. It's a prison with silk curtains. Concubines glide past, heads slightly bowed. Their footsteps are soft, but not out of grace. It's training. You hear muffled giggles behind one screen, and sharp words behind another. There are no locks, but no one here is free. You pause at a mosaic showing birds in flight. Ironic. Every woman here used to be one. Most concubines weren't from the empire itself. They were bought, gifted, or taken in war. Light skin was prized. Georgians, Circassians, Greeks. Some came from noble families, sold off in political desperation. Others were snatched in raids or captured by pirates. If they were beautiful and lucky, they were cleaned up and trained. If not, well, they didn't make it here. You duck your head as a eunuch passes with a tray of pomegranate seeds and rosewater. You don't speak. You don't have to. The weight of this place is in the silence. There's a common myth that harems were sex palaces full of endless pleasure. You quickly realise the truth is darker and sadder. It's a competitive arena, one filled with backstabbing, court intrigue, whispered alliances, and constant surveillance. Think Mean Girls meets statecraft, only no one's allowed to leave. In the corner, two women play chess. You watch one of them smile sweetly while moving her queen into checkmate. The other woman doesn't react. She's already planning revenge. Historians still argue whether concubines had power or were simply pawns. Some, like Roxolana or Shajar al-Dur, rose to influence sultans and even ruled in their own right. But for every one of those, there were thousands who died nameless, buried in unmarked graves outside the palace walls. Here's a fringe tidbit. Women in the harem were often trained in music, poetry, calligraphy, and etiquette. Not for their own enrichment, of course, but to better entertain their masters, or, if they were strategic, to captivate a sultan's attention long enough to survive another day. You pass a chamber where soft music plays. A girl barely past puberty is plucking a stringed instrument with trembling fingers. A matron nods approval. Behind her, two older concubines whisper about who might get summoned tonight. It hits you. Even success here isn't safe. Being chosen by the Sultan might mean power, but also jealousy. One misstep, and you could be poisoned, reassigned to the laundry rooms, or worse, disappear altogether. One concubine walks past you humming. There's a burn scar on her wrist, mostly hidden by her sleeve. You wonder about her story. You'll never know it. At night, the palace lights flicker. The harem shifts. It becomes quieter, somehow lonelier. Concubines retreat to their chambers. Some wait in anticipation. Others pray not to be noticed. A small group sits in a circle, muttering lullabies from distant homelands. Songs that once soothed them as children now serve as fragile lifelines to a world that forgot them. You watch a eunuch deliver a sealed letter, carefully, ceremoniously. The recipient reads it, expression unreadable. The air tightens. She's been summoned. Her companions immediately become cold, calculating. One smiles too brightly. Another excuses herself to prepare tea. The games begin. You see, here, intimacy is currency. A child by the Sultan means status, influence, maybe even a title. But pregnancy without favour, that could mean exile or death. The stakes are always lethal. Some women manage to secure positions as mothers of royal children, known as walad. This brings a measure of protection, and sometimes freedom. But again, it's conditional. Everything here is... You pass a window barred with ornate latticework. Through it, you glimpse a garden. Orange trees sway gently. It looks peaceful until you notice the guards just beyond it, their hands resting on scimitars. That garden is the closest thing these women have to outside. 7s. The cook tells you, without being asked, that cinnamon is the most requested spice in the harem kitchens. Comfort, she says with a sad smile. It tastes like memory. The woman in charge of this labyrinth is the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, usually a former concubine herself. She rules the harem like a seasoned general, balancing power plays, managing jealousy, and choosing which girls get their one shot at attention. It's not maternal, it's managerial. And if a concubine fails to perform or becomes inconvenient, she might be retired to a lower station or sent to another noble house as a gift. Translation. Traded like furniture. You notice one woman, older than the rest, sitting apart. She's embroidering quietly, hands steady. She's survived here longer than most. Maybe she learned when to stay silent, when to smile, and when to look invisible. The younger girls glance at her occasionally, some with respect, some with fear. You realise she's a legend in these walls. The kind of legend that whispers warnings between stitches. A soft bell rings. It's time. The chosen woman for tonight is led away, shoulders square, steps measured. You don't know if she's proud or terrified. Maybe both. You want to look away. You don't. She disappears behind an ornate door. The eunuchs close it silently. You're left staring at the mosaic again. Those birds, wings frozen mid-flight, never moving. The palace walls thin out behind you as you step into open desert. Wind whips fine sand across your cheeks, and the horizon stretches forever, harsh, golden, and wide. You follow a slow-moving caravan snaking its way across this brutal landscape. No treasure chests. No spices yet. Just people, shackled, barefoot, silent. These are the slave routes of Africa, and the empire's lifeblood flows through them. The line moves like a funeral procession, interrupted only by the grunt of camels and the occasional bark of a slaver. You see boys barely taller than their own packs, women with babies strapped to their backs, stumbling, men who used to be warriors, farmers, husbands. Now they march for days, weeks, even months. This is how they get to the Caliphates. From Ghana, Mali, Chad, and beyond. You're walking the trans-Saharan slave route, the artery of a system that fed North African markets, fueled palace kitchens, and stocked city labour pools. One merchant calls the people merchandise without a trace of irony. You want to punch him, but you're just a visitor here, watching, not changing. Mainstream history tends to focus on the Atlantic slave trade, big ships, colonial horrors. But this African pipeline was just as devastating. Slaves taken from the Sahel and West Africa were marched north across deserts, often dying en route. They were packed onto camels like saddlebags or forced to walk until their feet cracked open. You pass a skeleton, just bones half buried in the sand. No one glances down. It's normal. Some fringe accounts say slavers sometimes tied water skins just out of reach on long poles to motivate the slowest walkers. A trick of cruelty that combined desperation with humiliation. And if you were a woman, Your odds were worse. Many didn't make it past the first weeks. Some were raped. Others were separated and sold early along the route to local chiefs or passing traders. Your body wasn't your own, your future, a coin toss. Historians still argue over the scale, how many people were trafficked this way over centuries. Estimates stretch from the hundreds of thousands into the millions. What's clear is that most of those bodies disappeared into city households, workshops, and harems with no records, no names, and no graves. You stop to drink water. One slaverize you like you might be useful too, just for a second. Then he turns away. At one rest point, you notice the system behind it all. A desert depot with guards, shade tents, even scribes recording who passes through. This isn't chaos, it's logistics. There's order to the cruelty. Schedules. Inventory. A scribe mutters something about new batches arriving from Kono by next month. You want to scream, but the air is too dry. One older slave collapses ahead of you. No one stops. 2 guards drag him off the line, dump him behind a dune. That's it. The caravan doesn't pause. He just vanishes into the heat. And yes, not all African slaves in Islamic lands were treated the same. Some found stable homes or became soldiers. A lucky few earned freedom. But most were servants, concubines, or labourers with no path out. The romantic idea that Islamic slavery was more humane collapses fast out here, where even survival isn't guaranteed. You overhear one trader boasting about a sale he made in Cairo. 3 sisters, all sold to different homes. The youngest cried too much. He chuckles. The others nod, like this is funny. You feel sick. In the distance, date palms shimmer, an oasis. The caravan speeds up slightly. Everyone hopes for rest. Not because they'll be treated well, but because stopping means less pain, less heat. At the oasis, you see a new horror. A slave auction. Out here, yes. Portable, efficient, ruthless. Buyers examine teeth, flex limbs, sniff for disease. One man tastes a woman's skin for salt. Checking hydration, he says. You want to scrub that memory from your brain immediately. One curious fringe detail. Some enslaved Africans brought their music with them. Rhythms, chants, stories. In rare moments of pause, they sang. Not to entertain, but to remember. You catch a snippet of a call and response chant as night falls. It doesn't make things better, but it makes them human again, for a few breaths. You talk to a boy who looks about 12. He doesn't understand Arabic yet. He holds a carved wooden figure, maybe a gift, maybe the last thing from home. He hides it every time someone passes. When dawn breaks, the caravan moves again. Your feet hurt, and you're just pretending. You glance back, one figure's missing. A woman who lagged behind. No one says anything. This is how bodies become numbers, and numbers become history. Eventually, the caravan reaches Cairo. The gates loom tall, and the city hums beyond them. The slaves are herded off the road into the market district. The same rhythm again. Bath, clothes, catalogue, sale. There's no room for mercy in a system this polished. A buyer talks price over pomegranate juice. He points at 3 people, 2 girls and an older man. For domestic work, he says, like he's ordering furniture. You pass through the market, through all the polished stalls and perfumed robes, and realise this empire was built not just with marble and ink, but with broken backs and blistered feet. And no matter how golden the minarets, there's always a shadow at the base. You don't know exactly how you ended up in the marshlands of southern Iraq, but the air is different here, thick with heat, buzzing with mosquitoes, and tense with the feeling that something big is about to happen. You're standing on the edge of a slave encampment, and it's not quiet like the others. It's charged, angry, alive. You're about to witness something rare, a slave revolt. A real one. And not just any revolt. The Zanj Rebellion. The Zanj were mostly black African slaves, hauled across desert routes like the ones you just saw, then dumped into the brutal salt marshes outside Basra. Their job? Drain the swamps. Day in, day out. No glory, no rest, no reward. Just digging trenches, hauling silt, and trying not to die from heat stroke, snakes, or malnutrition. And here's the twist. These weren't lone labourers. This was industrial-scale slavery. The Abbasid Caliphate had hundreds of thousands of Zanj working in these marshes. Picture it. A forced labour camp that stretches to the horizon, full of bodies burning under the sun, year after year. The cruelty was systematic. But something shifts. A man named Ali ibn Muhammad shows up, preaching revolution. He's not Zanj himself, probably Persian, but he's clever, charismatic, and ambitious. He promises freedom, justice, and revenge. The Zanj listen. And then they rise. You watch it unfold in chaos. Mud-covered men swarm a plantation, overturning carts, burning tools. Overseers scream and fall. Others run. The revolt spreads like fire in dry grass. Mainstream history rarely gives this rebellion the attention it deserves. It lasted 15 years. That's longer than most empires survive. The Zanj seized cities, minted coins, built a navy. They weren't just rioting, they were running a parallel state. You trail them as they take over one settlement after another. You see camps transformed into training grounds, watchtowers go up, patrols organised. You think you've stepped into a guerrilla nation stitched together out of rage. And Ali ibn Muhammad? He moves like a prophet and a warlord rolled into one. Some saw him as a liberator, others as a manipulator. Historians still argue whether he genuinely cared for the Zanj or just used their anger as fuel for his own ambitions. You pass by a crude courtroom, where a former slave now sits in judgment over a captured Abbasid official. His hands shake as he reads the sentence. Power still feels foreign in his grip, but power, once tasted, is addictive. As the Zanj gain ground, so does their violence. You see raids on towns. Entire villages burned. Not just revenge, domination. Some reports say they began capturing and enslaving others, repeating the same cycle they once suffered. That's the paradox of revolutions. Sometimes the oppressed, once unchained, pick up the same whips. One fringe tidbit. Some Zanj rebels reportedly wore white robes to symbolize purity and divine favor, but the robes stained fast. The longer the revolt dragged on, the dirtier everything got. Ideals, uniforms, hands. You walk through their capital. Yes, they had one, called Al-Mukhtara, the Chosen. It buzzes with makeshift politics, loud debates, traders, soldiers. A living, breathing rebellion. But you also notice the strain. Supply chains cracking, leaders fighting, a storm coming, and it does. The Abbasids, embarrassed and enraged, send their best generals. Among them, Al-Muwaffaq, brother to the Caliph and a ruthless tactician. The empire stops underestimating the rebels. They bring siege engines, spies, mercenaries. The end isn't fast. It's a slow crush. You see the rebels pushed back, retreat by retreat. You hear the Zanj chant at night, words meant to summon courage, but you can hear the fatigue underneath. Then Al-Mukhtara falls. Fires rage. Screams tear through the swamps. You watch as Ali ibn Muhammad is killed, his body paraded through Basra, his followers executed, enslaved again, or simply vanished. One survivor tells you, "We built something, even for a while." His voice is cracked. His hands are raw, but his eyes hold pride. Historians still debate whether the Zanj revolt was a class war, an ethnic uprising, or a manipulated movement. Maybe it was all three. But it happened. It shook an empire. And it proved that even the most silenced people can roar. You walk back through the now quiet marshes, past burned-out huts and abandoned tools. The swamp is still here. The salt still seeps. But something changed. The Abbasids tightened control after the revolt. They decentralized some labor systems, kept closer watch on slave populations, and tried to erase the memory of the uprising. It didn't work. Because here you are, standing where it happened, listening to the ghost-thin echoes of men who once dreamed of freedom and nearly took it. The sun sets blood orange over the water. The insects return. The land looks the same, but you know what it cost. And you realise something else. The Empire feared this. Not the war. The idea that the machine could break, that the cogs could fight back. You leave the swamps behind, the scent of smoke and salt still lingering in your clothes, and drift back into the shadows of the city. Baghdad, Cairo, Damascus, take your pick. Doesn't matter. The streets all carry the same whisper, the same paranoia, because if a slave runs, someone will come looking. That someone is the Shurta, the state police. But let's be real, they're more than just cops in cloaks. Tonight, you're tailing a group of slave hunters. They don't wear uniforms. They don't flash badges. They blend in. Their job? Track down runaways, capture them, and bring them back to their owners, preferably alive, but no promises. You watch them fan out through a market, casually scanning faces. They're looking for a girl. She slipped away from a noble's house last week, a concubine, barely 16, apparently too clever for her station. You ask how they know she's here. One hunter taps his nose. "We have sources," he says, grinning. You're not comforted. Slave hunting wasn't a chaotic free-for-all. The Caliphates had systems, registration papers, physical descriptions, even scar patterns recorded in detail. You pass a kiosk where a clerk is flipping through parchment files like a medieval version of a police database. One fringe detail. Some elite households tattooed identification marks on their slaves' feet, hidden but traceable. If the slave was caught and denied their origin, the mark would give them away. You imagine being branded and then still expected to smile while serving dates and sherbet. Tonight, the Shurta have leads. Someone spotted the girl buying figs near the mosque. They check food stalls, speak to vendors, show a sketch that looks more like a vague outline than a portrait. Still, they're methodical. You follow quietly. Historians still argue whether the Shurta were formal law enforcers or private thugs on official payroll. Their methods weren't exactly subtle. Beatings, bribes, even torture, if that's what it took to get answers. One of the hunters bribes a beggar with a loaf of bread. He points toward a bathhouse. They move quickly now, no drama, just practiced momentum. They split into two groups and slip inside. You linger at the door, heart pounding. The bathhouse is quiet, steam curling from stone walls. You hear a scuffle, then silence. Moments later, the girl is dragged out. She's sobbing, barefoot, clothes soaked. One hunter wraps a robe around her, not out of kindness, just to avoid public scandal. She begs. They don't react. They march her through the street. No one intervenes. Some people avert their eyes. Others just watch. A few whisper, not out of sympathy, but out of gossip. "That's the one who ran," someone says, like she's a cautionary tale. You try to catch her eye. You want her to see someone sees her, but her face is locked in shock. She's gone inward. Back at the station, she's thrown into a holding cell. A scribe scribbles notes, confirming her reacquisition. Her master will be informed. A punishment will follow. You don't want to imagine what kind. And she's not alone. The cell holds 5 others, 2 boys from a merchant's estate, a kitchen servant accused of theft, and a man too old to keep pace with his assigned job and thus labelled disobedient. They're all waiting. For what? Depends who owns them. Sometimes it's lashes. Sometimes branding. Sometimes sale to a less forgiving master. Here's a fact. Slaves who tried to escape often faced brutal punishment. But the risk didn't stop them. And the more that ran, the more slave hunters rose to meet the demand. A grotesque arms race of fear and pursuit. You pass a hallway where recovered slaves are reconditioned, code for being intimidated into submission again. You hear shouting. A whip cracks once, then again. You stop listening. The shurta themselves are quiet now, sipping tea, comparing notes. This is just another night for them. A routine. But not every slave was brought back. Some disappeared into underground networks, safe houses, sympathetic merchants, fake documents. An early kind of resistance, scattered but real. There were whispers of people who smuggled slaves out of cities, dressed them as travellers, coached them on new identities. Tiny rebellions threaded through alleyways. One scholar centuries later described it as a river under the sand, always flowing, never visible. Historians still debate how effective these networks were, but they existed. That alone was radical. You find yourself in one such alley now, narrow and twisting. A boy darts past you, maybe 10 years old. He carries a bundle of food, then knocks 3 times on a wooden door. It opens just a crack. He disappears inside. The door shuts. You don't follow. You just stand there, listening to the wind in the corridor. Somewhere nearby, the shurta keep looking. Somewhere else, another slave gets caught. Another one escapes. The cat-and-mouse game never stops. It's the engine behind the silence in every wealthy home. The reason for the locks on the servant quarters. The whispers. The threats. And the girl they dragged from the bathhouse. Tomorrow, she'll be back in silks, serving in silence, head bowed. But the memory of cool water, of one day outside the walls, that might be enough to spark her again. Or break her. You walk away, heart heavy, into a night that suddenly feels colder than it should. The city wakes with the sun, golden light creeping through latticed windows, and you're already moving, slipping between archways and breakfast fires, following a different kind of current now. The morning hustle is alive with clinking pans, shouted greetings, and the swish of sweeping brooms. But listen closer, and you'll hear the quieter movements, the ones made by people who don't speak unless spoken to. You're stepping into a day in the life of a slave. And who you are depends entirely on the toss of a dice you never rolled. You pass 3 girls scrubbing pots near a bakery. One wears plain linen, her fingers raw from scouring. Another, dressed in soft silk with kohl-rimmed eyes, flirts with the baker's son while fetching cinnamon. Both are slaves. Their worlds couldn't be more different. Because here's the deal. Under the Caliphates, slavery came in all flavours. Some worked in the kitchens, others in the fields, still others in private chambers behind drawn curtains. Your fate, your entire life, was determined by who bought you, what they needed, and what you looked like the day you were put up for sale. You trail a boy delivering carpets. His pace is quick, eyes down. He's property of a merchant who breeds and trains slaves specifically for business errands. They don't talk, and they never steal. The merchant boasts proudly, as if he's describing livestock. A woman beside you mutters, field, house, or flesh. She's not joking. That's how buyers often categorise slaves. Manual labourers went to farms and construction sites. Domestic workers went into kitchens or homes. And the flesh market. That's where concubines came from. Women bought for entertainment, coercion dressed as courtship. Mainstream history sometimes softens this with the idea that Islam improved slavery by encouraging manumission and forbidding the worst abuses. And yes, technically, there were rules. But rules mean nothing when they live on parchment and not in practice. You pass a courtyard where 2 young girls are learning to pour tea with grace. One spills a few drops and immediately flinches. Her trainer doesn't yell, just tightens her lips and says, "Again." It's somehow scarier. A fringe detail. Wealthy buyers sometimes selected slaves based on astrological charts. If your star sign aligned well with your master's, you were considered a safe investment. Yeah, enslavement by zodiac. There's no end to human creativity when justifying cruelty. Now, you're inside a large estate. The master of the house lounges on a platform bed, sipping date wine. Around him, slaves move like clockwork. One fluffs pillows, another fans away flies, a third whispers poetry in his ear. Each knows their cue. Each knows the consequences of getting it wrong. You spot a servant girl with bruises on her arm. She notices your gaze and quickly pulls her sleeve down. The message is clear. Don't see me. Don't ask. One cook in the kitchen tells you, with a smirk, we don't beat the ones who work well. Only the lazy ones. He says it like it's compassion. You nod, even though your jaw's tight. Historians still argue whether domestic slaves had it easier. Sure, some had access to food, clothing, even education. But that comfort came wrapped in surveillance and unpredictability. You could be favoured one week and flogged the next. Kindness was as conditional as air. You slip out to the fields on the edge of the city. The sun hits hard here. Labourers bend over rows of chickpeas and onions, their backs arched, skin peeling. There's no music, no talk, just the rhythmic scrape of hoes and shovels. You speak to one older man who's worked this field for 20 years. "My son was born in the kitchen," he says quietly. He doesn't know what trees look like. His voice cracks, but only a little. And then there are the entertainers. You find one at a wealthy woman's party. He dances with practiced ease, fingers like ribbons, smile fixed. He's been trained since childhood to read a room, shift moods, distract guests. He's dazzling, until the music stops and no one looks at him anymore. He stands awkwardly, like a puppet waiting to be hung back on a nail. Some masters were kind. They allowed slaves to marry, raise families, save for freedom. But the law was clear. No marriage without permission. No property without oversight. Even your children, if born to a slave mother, might be declared property. 2. One particularly unsettling scene unfolds when a young mother tries to hide her newborn during a routine head count. The steward finds the child, lifts him like a bundle of bread, and says, "The master will decide if he's worth keeping." You feel something rupture in you. The randomness of it all is what gnaws at you most. 2 girls from the same village, one ends up singing lullabies to the caliph's youngest, the other dies in a field breaking rocks. Neither had a say. You spot a freedman in the marketplace, running a small stall. He wears his papers around his neck, proof of manumission. But customers still call him abid, the word for slave. Freedom doesn't scrub away status. One woman, still in service after 30 years, tells you softly, you learn to make yourself small. To be useful, but not noticeable. That's the safest place to live. You ask her name. She hesitates before answering. They changed it. I don't remember the first one. 7s. By nightfall, you're back in the home of a wealthy scribe. His personal slave offers you tea. She smiles, polite, graceful. Then, when no one's looking, she drops her handkerchief near your foot. On it, in tiny embroidery, is a single word. Run. The tea goes cold in your hand as you stare at that embroidered word. Run. But before you can react, the slave girl's face reverts to smooth serenity, her eyes blank as stone. Someone's approaching. She nods, takes the cup back, and vanishes into the walls like smoke. You never see her again. Now you're somewhere quieter. A mosque courtyard, calm and symmetrical, where fountains gurgle and pigeons peck at crumbs left from midday prayer. This place radiates peace. White stone, blue tiles, sun-washed stillness. You feel like you're stepping into a better version of the world, but you've learned to look behind the veil. And behind this one, a contradiction that burns hotter than the sun on these marble floors. Because here, in these sacred halls, in sermons and legal rulings and courtly debates, slavery wasn't just tolerated, it was justified, blessed, rationalised through religious texts. You're about to hear how compassion and cruelty shook hands. An imam steps up to deliver a sermon. His voice is clear, his tone kind. He speaks of justice, of mercy, of zakat and prayer and treating others with dignity. Then, with barely a breath, he transitions into the proper treatment of slaves. How to clothe them, feed them, discipline them, as if he's describing livestock care. The crowd listens. Some nod. Few glance at the slaves standing quietly behind their masters, holding sandals and water skins. It's jarring. You're in a holy space, and yet the very foundation rests on human ownership. Here's the fact most people sidestep. The Quran does not outlaw slavery. In fact, it references it often, regulating it, embedding it into society. There are verses encouraging kindness to slaves, even urging freeing them as an act of piety. But the practice itself? Accepted. Historians still argue whether this was a reflection of its time or a spiritual loophole left intentionally open. Some say Islam began to phase out slavery. Others say it simply managed it better. Either way, the result is the same. Sanctified bondage. And the hadiths, sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, are full of instructions about slaves. Treat them well. Don't overwork them. Feed them what you eat. But even then, it's within the structure of ownership. You're still talking about human beings as property, even if you do it politely. You overhear a scholar defending his house full of servants. Islam isn't like the Romans, he says, smug. We don't abuse. We civilise. You bite your tongue, remembering the calluses you saw on that kitchen girl's hands. One fringe detail. Some scholars claimed freeing a slave could erase certain sins, like skipping Ramadan or lying in court. So, owning a person was not only accepted, but also turned into a kind of spiritual currency. Commit a sin? Just buy someone and free them. Problem solved. A merchant nearby agrees. Slaves give us two things, help in this life and mercy in the next. He says it while chewing almonds. You want to slap the plate out of his hand. And here's a kicker. Owning a Muslim slave was considered less acceptable, though not impossible. Non-Muslims were the preferred targets, especially captives from Africa, Europe, or Central Asia. Convert them? Sure. But after you've bought them, you pass a classroom where children recite legal codes in sing-song Arabic. A master may not strike the face, they chant. A master must not starve. Good rules, if they were followed. But you've already seen how often they weren't. You peek into a study circle where judges argue over a case involving a slave who tried to marry without permission. One jurist insists she be flogged. Another suggests leniency. Not one questions why she needed permission to begin with. The law is a cage, not a ladder. A former slave now turned servant. You catch his name, Rafi, leans over to you and whispers, "They call us brothers in faith. But in chains, we're mute." His voice is soft, but his stare cuts deep. You walk through another prayer hall. Someone has written a quote on the wall in ink so fine you almost miss it. A just master is better than a cruel king. You don't know whether to be moved or horrified. Historians still debate whether Islamic slavery was better than what came later in European colonies. But better doesn't mean good. Slavery with poetry is still slavery. And the contradiction lives on. The Caliphates claimed moral superiority. They banned alcohol, enforced prayer, and cultivated gardens of science and art. But within those gardens, people lived and died in invisible cages, praised for their obedience, punished for their thoughts. One young imam in training tells you, proudly, Slaves in Islam have rights. You ask him if they can say no. He hesitates, then answers, they can accept their place with dignity. You don't ask again. The sun starts to dip, and the mosque fills for evening prayer. Rows upon rows of men bow in unison, a sea of backs and breath. And just behind them, another line stands, slaves holding shoes, collecting cloaks, waiting. Not praying, just waiting. You step outside as the call to prayer echoes across rooftops. It's beautiful, haunting, perfect. But the silence behind it? That's louder. The city cools under the evening sky, shadows lengthening like silent spectators across the palace walls. You find yourself back inside, only this time, in the inner sanctum of power. The Sultan's court. Marble floors gleam. Braziers crackle softly. Perfume lingers in the air like an expensive lie. But you're not here for the man in the throne. You're here for the women who orbit him, and what happens when that orbit breaks. You pass a narrow hallway veiled in silk, and beyond it, the chamber of the chosen one. Not the queen, not a wife, a concubine, a slave plucked from obscurity, and now, possibly, the most powerful woman in the empire, until she isn't. You catch a glimpse of her now, dressed in emerald silk, sitting calmly on a divan as musicians play for her. Her fingers are jewelled. Her smile is practiced. Her eyes? Calculating. She's made it farther than most, but the ground beneath her is thin as ice. Because in the harem, being the Sultan's favourite meant everything, until he changed his mind. You know this woman's story. Everyone does. She was purchased young, trained to dance, recite poetry, even solve riddles. The Sultan saw her once, maybe by chance, maybe by design, and she became his. From that moment, she lived under a different set of rules. Mainstream accounts often glamorize this role, like she's some kind of Cinderella in a desert palace. But this isn't a fairy tale. It's a knife's edge. You overhear a eunuch whispering, "She's pregnant." That changes the game. A concubine who bore a child, especially a son, could never be sold. In some cases, she could gain freedom, even influence court politics. She might become al-Walad, mother of the child, an untouchable status, but also a walking target. Historians still argue whether concubines truly held sway or were merely figureheads. Some, like Hurrem Sultan, Roxolana, shaped policy, waged diplomatic battles, and even manipulated succession. Others were poisoned before they could even learn the Sultan's favourite colour. One fringe detail: some sultans had codes to rotate concubines by schedule. Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, no repeats, no favourites. But human nature isn't easily organised. Feelings happen, jealousy spreads, and so does ambition. You step into a smaller chamber where another concubine waits in silence. She hasn't been summoned in weeks. She adjusts her earrings, counts her beads, whispers a prayer. She knows what silence means here. It isn't peace, it's purgatory. When a concubine fell from favour, the descent was fast. Some were reassigned to lower duties, others quietly disposed of. The stories say some were sent to remote towns with a small stipend and a warning never to speak of the palace again. But darker tales linger. A poisoned sherbet. A scarf tightened just a second too long. A bath that grew too quiet. You pass a chamber heavy with incense. Inside lies a girl barely 16, eyes closed, skin pale. She was sick, someone mutters. You don't ask what kind of sickness. You already know. And yet, despite all this, some of them rose. Not just to safety, but to power. The mother of a sultan could command respect from generals. She could issue orders, settle disputes, manage harem politics. She could change laws, whispered suggestions that soon became decrees. But even then, she was still once a slave. That mark never fades. One concubine leans toward you during a music performance. Her voice is low, trembling with irony. They say we are flowers in a garden. She glances at the guards lining the exit. But flowers don't get to leave. 7s. Outside the court, people write poems about these women. Songs. Folk tales. Always the beautiful mystery. Never the broken truth. You pass a mural showing a former concubine holding a child. Her smile is radiant, painted in lapis and gold. But there's no record of what happened to her after the painting was finished. In another room, you see a boy, maybe 6 years old, the son of a concubine. He's dressed richly, studying calligraphy under a tutor. If he's lucky, he might inherit the throne. If he's unlucky, a half-brother might smother him in his sleep. That's how dynasties stayed orderly. 7s. And here's the unspoken rule. The higher you rise, the further you can fall. A concubine elevated to Queen Mother status could influence everything. But the moment she slipped, misread a court alliance, failed to bear another son, lost the Sultan's favour, she might vanish like she never existed. You sit in a small balcony above the court, watching nobles argue over tax grain while a concubine waits in the corner, pouring wine. No one speaks to her. No one thanks her. But they all notice when she smiles at the right moment. She has power, but not hers. Borrowed power. Fragile power. Later, walking down a corridor of portraits, you see face after face, concubines painted in idealized grace, none labelled with names. Just titles. The Jewel. The Sun. The Third Night. Their real identities lost. Their stories erased. You touch the edge of one canvas. The eyes stare back, blank and eternal. Somewhere behind you, a harp starts playing. Someone is being summoned. Another night. Another favourite. Another woman balancing on the blade of a smile. You're on the road again, but it feels more like being dragged across time than walking. The terrain changes, greyer, cooler, more forest than sand. You pass crumbling fortresses and stone chapels as whispers of bells float through the air. You're not in Baghdad or Cairo anymore. You're somewhere in the Balkans. But it's not the scenery that grabs you. It's the silence of a village after the soldiers leave. The Devshirme system. That's your next stop. The blood tax. One of the most haunting legacies of the Ottoman Caliphate. You arrive in a mountain village just as dusk falls. There's tension in the air, and not the normal kind. Doors are shut, shutters barred. You hear nothing but the clatter of boots in the distance. Ottoman agents are coming, and they're not after gold or grain. They're here for boys. You watch as mothers clutch their children, trying to hide them in cellars or behind goat sheds. It rarely works. The officials arrive with a list, and the list always wins. The Devshirme was a state-organised child levy. Every few years, Christian communities in the empire were forced to surrender a quota of boys, usually ages 8 to 18. The younger the better. The prettier, even better than that. You follow a line of selected boys, quiet, dazed, some sniffling, others stiff with confusion. They're told they're being taken to the capital to serve the Sultan. Some are promised education, good clothes, a better life. Some believe it. Most don't. One fringe detail? Some families bribe the collectors to take their sons, hoping for a better fate than rural poverty. Others mutilated their children, blinding, laming them, just to make them ineligible. Desperation made monsters out of everyone. The boys are marched for days to Istanbul. Once they arrive, the transformation begins. Christian names stripped, clothes burned, circumcision performed, Turkish taught, Islam drilled in through rote memorization and reward-punishment cycles. Historians still argue whether this was religious conversion or cultural engineering. The truth? It was both. and neither were optional. Some were sent to farms to toughen up. Others, especially those showing promise, were funneled into palace schools. There, they trained in language, swordsmanship, diplomacy, even music. This wasn't just enslavement. It was reprogramming. And what did they become? Janissaries. You walk among them now, teenagers in crisp uniforms, eyes cold, movements fluid. They look nothing like the village boys they once were. They stand straighter, speak Turkish fluently, and show absolute obedience to the Sultan. They are elite, feared, and, ironically, enslaved. Because no matter how high they rise in the military or court, they are still kapakulu, slaves of the gate. The Sultan owns them. Not metaphorically. Legally. One janissary brushes past you, face unreadable. His sword gleams. His posture is perfect. You wonder if he even remembers the chapel he once knelt in. The mother who wept as he was taken. You hear a tale whispered in the barracks. One janissary encountered his brother on the battlefield, now grown, now a rebel. They didn't speak. One killed the other. No tears. Just duty. And here's the twist. The janissaries weren't just soldiers. They became kingmakers. Over time, they gained power, privileges, even the right to marry, a rule that had been forbidden for centuries. They staged coups, murdered sultans, and dictated terms. Slaves, yes, but with swords pointed at the throne. A fringe tidbit. At their peak, janissaries were forbidden to grow beards. They could only wear moustaches. This was a visual symbol of their difference, neither servant nor free man. Just other. Sevens. And the psychological cost. You can feel it in the quiet moments, when a soldier gazes too long at a church bell, or flinches at the sight of a boy hiding behind his father. There are scars here, hidden under medals. Historians still debate whether the devshirme was enslavement or recruitment, whether janissaries were victims or collaborators, but that binary doesn't hold up. They were both, stolen and celebrated, broken and remade. One veteran tells you, "I have no past, just orders." He says it without bitterness. That might be the saddest part. Eventually, the devshirme was abolished. Not out of mercy, but in efficiency. The empire modernised, the need for child levies faded, and the janissaries, so powerful now, became a threat. In 1826, the Sultan ordered their massacre. Tens of thousands were killed in one swoop. You pass their old barracks, now a museum. Inside, uniforms hang in glass cases. Swords gleam under spotlights. Tourists whisper. No one screams. And somewhere, still echoing in the mountain valleys, you can almost hear the boots returning. The lists unfolding. The mothers begging. Because memory doesn't die. It just sleeps. Like the boy taken from his home who grows into a man who forgets his own name, until he sees it carved in a chapel wall. Morning in the city again. The streets are alive, as usual, merchants haggling, camels groaning under bundles, children darting through alleys. And somewhere among them, a man walks free. He's not chained. He wears no brand. No guard follows him. He's technically a freed slave, Mukatab or Matuk. And yet, every glance he gets, every door that stays shut, every price that mysteriously doubles when he steps up to a stall, tells you that freedom here comes with a leash. You tail him through the city. His name's Amir. He's tall, mid-30s, well-spoken, used to serve a judge, cleaned his ink pots, copied legal texts, even memorised Quranic verses for him. One day, the judge decided to honour his years of loyalty by granting his freedom. On paper, it was a generous act. The court clerk recorded it with a flourish. There were witnesses. Amir was given a robe and a pair of sandals to mark the moment. A new life, they said. But you quickly learn, new life doesn't mean new status. He tries to rent a small shop to sell ink and quills. The landlord raises an eyebrow when he hears Amir was once a Mamluk. Your kind should stick to service, he mutters. Price, double. He visits a public bath. The attendant nods, but makes him wait until others are done. Policy, he says. There's no sign about it. You start to notice how people refer to him, Amir, the former servant. Amir, who used to be owned by Sheikh Zaid. Never just Amir. The past clings like smoke. Mainstream history books mention that the Islamic world encouraged the freeing of slaves. And yes, that's true. There were formal procedures, often linked to religious virtue. A master might free a slave during Ramadan, or upon their own deathbed. Sometimes slaves could buy their freedom by installments, a kitaba contract. But owning your body again doesn't mean you own your future. Historians still argue whether the Islamic manumission system was truly liberating, or just another level in a rigid hierarchy. The freed were free, yes, but not equal. Many laws and customs kept them a step below. In courts, their testimonies could be dismissed. In marriage, they were discouraged from seeking spouses of higher status. In business, credit was harder to secure. You trail Amir to a gathering, a coffeehouse debate, full of poets and thinkers. He sits in the back. When he speaks, his point is sharp, eloquent. A few heads nod, but one man squints and says, "Weren't you a slave once? Let those who never bowed teach the rest of us." Sevens. Amir smiles, but the sting's visible. You follow him into the outskirts of the city, where many freed slaves live, whole communities, neighbourhoods made of patched brick and patched pride. Some do well, others survive. Most just try to forget. One fringe tidbit. Certain freed slaves adopted their former master's name as their own surname, not out of affection, but necessity. It gave them social weight, but it also kept the chain linked, even symbolically. Amir? He still goes by Amir ibn Zaid. Not because he wants to, but because Amir from nowhere gets no respect. In one courtyard, you meet a woman named Halima, freed years ago after decades of domestic service. She runs a bathhouse now, but still uses the old vocabulary. My lady used to like rosewater. I serve better than the girls now. You realise she never stopped being a servant. Her job changed. Her posture didn't. You hear stories of others who try to travel, join the military, study abroad, start new trades. But without a patron, a freed slave faced a wall. The Caliphate's social structure was built on networks, not merit. If you weren't born into privilege, you needed someone to sponsor your ascent. And former slaves? They rarely had anyone left. One man describes it like this. I left the cage, but the door stays open behind me. I keep turning back. Sevens. Even religion didn't always soften the blow. Mosques were meant to be places of unity. But you overhear a preacher refuse to let a freedman lead prayers. Let the freeborn do it, he says. The congregation must feel dignity. A verse about equality follows. No one flinches. You visit the graveyard on the city's edge. Some headstones bear names. Others just read, Freedmen of X, as if their freedom was a footnote, not a headline. And yet, many kept striving. Opened shops, taught children, cooked, danced, wrote poetry, told jokes. One man, a freed African soldier, became a local hero for saving a merchant's daughter from a runaway camel. They gave him a robe, not citizenship, but a robe. Historians still debate the extent of their mobility. Some records show freed slaves climbing high, managing estates, even becoming governors in rare cases. But for every success, there are 100 quiet, invisible lives. Back with Amir, you walk through the square at dusk. He nods to a few neighbours, carries his ink jars home. Children run past him without fear. A good sign. He invites you to tea. His home is modest but neat. On the wall hangs a calligraphy piece he copied by hand. It reads, "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." You sip quietly. He smiles, and you realise he's freer than most, not because the system changed, but because he refused to let it shrink him. Still, when the wind blows, you swear you can hear the rusted hinges of a door that was never fully closed. It starts with a knock at the door. Not the pounding kind. This one's polite, almost apologetic. But what follows changes everything. A man stands outside with a ledger. His robes are clean, his face impassive. He's here on behalf of the state, and he's not taking donations. He's here for taxes. You're now deep in the countryside, in a modest village built of clay and prayer. It's harvest season, but the mood is grim. The tax collectors arrived, and families are scrambling. Not just for coins, but for something, anything, to pay with. This is where the system gets ugly. The Caliphates had a tax structure that looked rational on the surface. Zakat for Muslims, a kind of alms tax. Jizya for non-Muslims, a per capita tax that bought protection and, let's be real, the right to exist. And Kharaj, a land tax that kept the wheels of empire turning. In theory, it was manageable. In practice, it crushed people. You follow one family now, Christian farmers living on land they've tended for generations. The Kharaj has gone up this year. Again. The jizya has too. They sold their extra tools last season. This time, there's nothing left to offer. The father walks out of the house, pale and shaking. He's carrying his youngest son. The taxman doesn't blink. Just writes something in his ledger and nods. "You'll get a receipt," he says. A receipt. For a child. You try to stop him. You can't. This was real. Families under economic collapse sometimes sold their own children to cover debts or taxes. Not always officially. Sometimes it was temporary apprenticeship. Sometimes just a handshake and a goodbye. Historians still argue how widespread this was. Some claim it was rare. Others suggest it was disturbingly common in rural provinces. What's clear is that desperation was the bridge, and the state didn't stop it. In some cases, it encouraged it. You pass another family who try to avoid payment. Their house is being dismantled, timbers taken as collateral. The father's being dragged to a holding cell. His wife stands in the dirt, holding a baby, trying to explain to a man with a feathered pen that they don't even own the land. No one listens. One fringe tidbit? In some areas, collectors were given bonuses based on how much they brought in, above the quota. So, guess what that led to? Pressure, manipulation, voluntary donations of daughters or sons. And while Muslims paid fewer taxes in theory, the poorest weren't immune. Zakat still came due. And if you defaulted, public shame. Legal trouble, maybe imprisonment. But the real fear wasn't prison. It was losing your children to the man with the ledger. You find yourself in a cramped tax office. Parchments everywhere. Calculations in black ink. Notes like 5 sheep short, consider child, or offer work detail to older son. A clerk sips rosewater and scratches his beard. It's the system, he says, not cruelty. You want to believe him. But then you see a column labelled transfers. Names, ages, destinations. This wasn't chaos. It was policy. And sometimes entire communities were targeted. You walk through a minority enclave. Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, all non-Muslims, all jizya payers. The collectors come more often here. Why? Less legal resistance. Fewer patrons. No political clout. A boy shows you his old home, empty now. "We couldn't pay any more," he says. "They took my sister. Said she'd work in the governor's kitchens. He doesn't cry. He just stares at the wall where her name used to be scratched in charcoal. There's another layer to all this. Corruption. You overhear two officials discussing soft targets, families with multiple daughters, no husbands, no tribal protection. Easier to intimidate. Easier to convince into payment through servitude. One officer jokes. Sometimes the slaves show up before the tax bill. No one laughs. You walk past a makeshift slave market on the city edge. A young girl stands with a sign around her neck. Family debt. She doesn't speak Arabic yet. Her expression is blank. And here's the most twisted irony. Some buyers were the same officials who taxed her family into collapse. Mainstream records show that caliphs occasionally intervened, cancelling debts, granting amnesty. But those were exceptions. Performative mercy. The engine of collection rolled on, town by town, house by house. You sit with an elderly imam who tries to explain the justice behind it all. We tax to protect, he says. Slavery is a mercy compared to starvation. You stare at him, unsure whether he believes it, or just needs to. Historians still debate the moral framework. Was this survival economics? Or state-sanctioned trafficking? Truth lives somewhere in the grime between the lines. A final scene burns into your memory. A mother at the market, selling her wedding necklace. She holds her son's hand tightly. She's almost there, just a few coins short. You hope she makes it. You really do. Because you've seen what happens when she doesn't. You've seen how tax collectors carry more than ledgers. They carry knives, contracts, chains. And the saddest part? They call it lawful. You've spent days neck deep in the brutality, markets, chains, mutinies, and ledgers soaked in human desperation. Now, for a moment, things go quiet. You're in a madrasa, a school. The walls here are covered in books, not blood. Inkwells dot the desks. Sandals sit neatly by the doorway. This is supposed to be the empire's mind, the heart of its knowledge. And yet, even here, slavery lingers like a shadow no one wants to acknowledge. You step through arched halls where students recite verses and scribble hadiths onto parchment. Young men debate logic, math, astronomy. A teacher talks passionately about Aristotle, about Plato. There's laughter, philosophy, elegant insults flung across tables like flying paper. But when someone mentions a slave rebellion, the room tenses. One student clears his throat and says, "They were wrong to rise against their masters." Another shakes his head, but doesn't argue. The conversation slides back to metaphysics. Neatly avoided. Here's the strange part. These scholars knew everything. The Caliphates preserved and expanded Greek science, Indian medicine, Persian poetry. They debated fate, the cosmos, the soul. But somehow, the idea of questioning slavery, that didn't make it onto the syllabus. Historians still argue why. Some say it was too entangled in the economy to challenge. Others claim scholars feared undermining Islamic jurisprudence, which regulated but didn't prohibit slavery. A few insist that challenging the practice would have meant directly confronting the Quran, and few dared go there. One fringe tidbit. There were a few whispers. A rare philosopher in Basra once argued that no human could own another without damaging his own soul. His books quietly disappeared from the shelves a year later. Coincidence, right? You peek into a lecture where an imam explains fiqh, Islamic law. Today's topic: the etiquette of slave ownership. Students nod along as he outlines rulings. Don't strike the face. Feed them well. Offer them freedom if they serve long enough. It's presented almost like a spiritual checklist. And there it is again, that unbearable contradiction. A religion that talks about mercy, about brotherhood, about equality before God, but also offers a manual for how to keep another person legally yours. You sit with a student named Yusuf. Bright, gentle, eager. He's reading a commentary on Ibn Khaldun. You ask what he thinks about slavery. He hesitates. "It's complicated," he says. "Our prophet encouraged manumission, but he also kept slaves. So we follow the example." Sevens. You push further. "Should it still exist?" He frowns. The Caliphate doesn't take new slaves like before, mostly captives of war. He pauses. "But if we abolish it entirely, are we defying revelation?" Sevens. There it is. The trap. Not logic, not economics, but fear of disobedience. You pass a garden courtyard. Two scholars argue under a fig tree, loudly, brilliantly, about free will versus divine decree. You want to interrupt, ask about actual freedom, but you already know how they'll dodge it. In the library, a massive collection of texts lines the walls. Books on astronomy, poetry, medicine, law. You run your fingers along the spines and realise that none of them challenge the structure that made their production possible. Scribes, servants, patrons, often slaves. One book catches your eye, an old legal treatise. You flip through until you find a chapter titled On the Liberation of Slaves. It lists dozens of conditions for freeing one, as an act of charity, to expiate sins, for piety. But not once does it question the institution itself. And then the thought hits you. What if the system was so embedded that even geniuses couldn't see it? You walk past a group of scholars dining under a stone portico. Their food is served by a young boy with downcast eyes. They thank him, kindly. But not once does anyone ask his name. You overhear them discussing the concept of oral, justice. One says, "True justice begins with inner balance." You want to throw a plate. Mainstream historians like to describe this era as the golden age of Islam. And yes, there's beauty here, mathematics, art, ideas that outlived empires. But it's also gilded over an uncomfortable truth. The brilliance of this world rested, in part, on the backs of those who weren't allowed to speak, think, or own their own lives. One teacher closes his lecture with a verse. "The ink of the scholar is more sacred than the blood of the martyr." You remember that same phrase on Amir's wall, but now it tastes different, because you've seen what that ink forgot to write. You step out into the street again. The madrasa fades behind you. No chains there, no shouting, just the quiet violence of omission, and that might be the hardest kind to name. You're sweating again, but this time it's not palace heat or desert sun, it's plantation air. Wet, thick, humming with insects. You're far from the clean geometry of the city now, surrounded by rows of sugarcane that stretch like green walls into the horizon. Welcome to the fields. The Caliphates didn't just conquer and prey, they produced. And that meant agriculture on an industrial scale. Sugar, rice, cotton, indigo, and spices. And behind every luxurious bite or fragrant whiff was a line of broken backs and sun-scorched necks. You follow a caravan of slaves down a muddy road toward a plantation complex outside Basra. The crops here don't grow themselves. They're fed by sweat, drawn from the hands of men and women who'll never taste the goods they harvest. A steward barks orders as the slaves fan out into the fields. Some carry scythes, others shoulder baskets. Their feet squelch in muck. There's no shade. One girl stumbles under the weight of her bundle. The overseer barely glances, just jerks his head toward another slave to take her place. She limps to the edge of the field, crumples by a tree, and keeps working anyway. The sugar trade was especially brutal. The stalks were tall, the harvest constant, and the tools sharp. Deep cuts weren't uncommon. Infections followed. If you couldn't keep pace, you were replaced. And here's the kicker. Many of these slaves were brought from East Africa or the Indian subcontinent specifically for this labour. Black African slaves, in particular, were stereotyped as more durable for fieldwork. The racism baked into the labour plan was as thick as the humidity. One fringe detail. To prevent escape, some plantations rotated languages. That's right. Owners deliberately bought slaves from different regions so they couldn't talk to each other. Isolation by design. You spot a slave who's been here long enough to earn trust. He's allowed to carry tools. He even shouts orders. But he still flinches when the steward approaches. Trust is temporary. Property is permanent. Mainstream historians sometimes brush past this side of the Caliphate economy, focusing on trade routes, scholars, and innovation. But sugar doesn't get to Damascus by poetry alone. It takes shipping, milling, and men who never stop swinging blades. You step into the processing area now, a low building thick with steam. Inside, slaves boil cane into syrup, skim scum, stir vats the size of bathtubs. One man's arms are blistered from years of this. He doesn't stop moving. Another worker slips on the slick floor. Hot syrup splashes. No one reacts. Accidents happen. He'll be replaced if he can't walk tomorrow. You glance at a shipping manifest nailed to the wall. The dates are tight. Production targets rigid. No room for mercy. The Caliph's court expects shipments, and merchants expect coin. Historians still debate whether plantation slaves under Islamic rule fared better than those in the Caribbean centuries later. But standing here, you stop caring about comparative suffering. Suffering is suffering. Outside, a merchant arrives with two officials. They inspect the fields like they're choosing rugs, casually, greedily. One notes the progress. Good, he says. The demand in Aleppo is rising. He doesn't ask who cuts the stalks. You trail him into a shaded tent. He orders tea. The servant who pours it has bleeding knuckles. He's a teenager. Later, you wander to a resting hut. Inside, a few slaves doze on mats. One carves shapes into the dirt with his finger. Maybe they're letters. Maybe they're maps of somewhere he'll never return to. And then there are the women. Some work in the fields. Others are stationed in kitchens or spice stores. But too often, they're consigned to entertainment, singing, dancing, serving wealthy guests who view them as scenery. One girl tells you in a whisper that she was promised work in the governor's kitchen. Instead, she ended up serving wine at parties where the price of failure was more than just being fired. A guard walks by. Everyone goes quiet. You walk down a row of palms and find a small shrine. Someone left dates and rose petals on a stone. Maybe to honour a friend who died. Maybe to remember a home they haven't seen in decades. And still, the plantation hums. Always moving. Always extracting. One man, grey-haired, sun-leathered, leans on a fence post and says, "The cane drinks more than water." You ask what he means. He points to the field. It drinks us. Sevens. A fringe scholar once claimed that plantation slaves under the Caliphates had occasional festivals, days of music and dance to lift morale. Maybe. But no song undoes this weight. Not one. As you leave the compound, a ship unloads new arrivals. They're thinner, quieter, not yet broken in. You know what's ahead for them. So do the older slaves. But no one says anything. The overseer nods to the captain. "On time," he says. And you realise the cruelty here isn't just in the whip. It's in the silence. The normalisation. The fact that this isn't a scandal, this is Tuesday. Back in the city, the noblewoman stirs sugar into her tea. She doesn't ask where it came from. She just smiles and says, "Perfect." Sevens. You've seen the price. Night drapes over the city like a velvet curtain, quieting the chaos but not the tension. You're in an alley now, narrow and winding, the kind of place no official map records and no patrol dares linger. Someone whispers your name, or maybe a name that sounds like yours. You follow. This isn't a place of despair. Not tonight. It's a place of desperation. Because here, In the shadows, people are trying to disappear. You've entered the world of escape, of slaves risking everything to run, to vanish, to breathe air that isn't borrowed. And they don't always do it alone. They have help. Fragile threads of resistance woven into kitchens, bathhouses, butcher stalls, spice carts. It's not an underground railroad. It's an underground tightrope. You duck behind crates as a man in dusty robes leads a girl down a side street. Her head is shaved. Her robe is torn to make her look like a beggar. Yesterday, she poured sherbet for a vizier. Today, she's walking barefoot toward the southern gate, holding her breath with every step. Most runaways didn't have maps or plans. They had instincts. And if they were lucky, they had accomplices, often other slaves, sympathetic merchants, or even rival factions happy to stick it to a rival household. You follow another case now. A kitchen boy named Malik. He's small, fast, and invisible, perfect for errands. He's been hoarding food scraps, threading coins into his sleeves. Tonight's the night. He slips out during the call to prayer, when everyone's distracted. The guards yawn. The dogs are chained. He runs. The fringe detail? Some slaves cross-dress to escape. Girls posed as boys. Boys as travelling eunuchs or holy pilgrims. The disguise was their only armour. Malik? He's wearing a turban too big for his head, hoping to pass as a student. He walks stiffly, trying to look purposeful. You trail him as he darts through bazaars, hugging walls, cutting through crowds. His destination? A barber shop near the docks. Not for a haircut. For forged papers. The barber glances once, nods, then hands over a bundle wrapped in rags. New sandals. A letter of recommendation. A worn prayer bead string. Just enough to pass inspection. Historians still argue how extensive these escape networks were. Some say they were local, improvised. Others claim there were coordinated efforts, especially among communities of freedmen and outcasts. Maybe both are true. You listen to whispered codes passed between shopkeepers. The falcon flies tonight means there's movement. 2 cups of vinegar means safe house. The phrases mean nothing to most, but everything to the desperate. You duck into one such house, a storage room behind a dyer's shop. Inside, 4 people huddle. One woman used to serve in a bathhouse. Another man was a camel handler. Both are too old for hard labour now. They wait, silent. One mends a sandal, the other prays softly. Escape wasn't just about movement. It was about reinvention. If you didn't have a new story, a new name, a new trade, you'd be spotted in days. A merchant tells you that he once hired a runaway slave, knowing full well she was illegally free. He paid her half wages. She had no papers, he says with a shrug. Still, she worked like 2 men. Then he laughs. You don't. And the risk? Massive. Captured runaways could be branded, flogged, mutilated, resold to harsher owners, or simply disappeared. You pass the city walls. The guard inspects a line of travellers. Malik waits his turn. You hold your breath with him. His heart is racing. His voice trembles. The guard squints at his papers, nods, waves him through. Malik doesn't run. He walks, steady, controlled, but when he rounds the corner, he lets out a single sob. He made it. For now. You learn that some ran not to cities but to the desert. Bandit groups, nomads, even rogue Sufi orders sometimes sheltered fugitives. They weren't saints, but they hated the central state more than they feared its laws. One bandit tells you, "We don't care where you came from. Can you shoot straight?" That's the test. Not pedigree, not paperwork, just survival. You also hear about runaways who escaped but never found peace. They changed names, changed cities, even changed religions, but they lived in fear. Every knock on the door sounded like a bounty hunter. Every stranger could be the past in disguise. Some turned themselves back in, not out of guilt, but exhaustion. Historians still debate whether manumission or escape played a larger role in reducing slavery over time. The truth is, escape was resistance. Not just physically, but emotionally. Every runaway was a hole in the system, a refusal to comply, a heartbeat that refused to be written off. You walk back through a quiet alley. Someone hands you a scroll sealed with wax. Inside, a poem. Short. Furious. Anonymous. I was born of silence. Sevens, made to serve the tongue of kings. But I took my name back. Sevens, and now I walk without chains. You look up. The girl who handed it to you is already gone. Just footprints in the dust. You follow those footprints through narrow streets and across decades. The dust clings to your sandals as time shifts again. The city's colours brighten, the accents change, and the air smells faintly of saffron and jasmine. You're somewhere in the past. Yes, but tonight, you're tracing bloodlines. Deep ones. Surprising ones. You're here to meet the forgotten mothers of dynasties. The concubines who bore sultans. The enslaved women who became queens in everything but name. In the marble halls of power, you step into a room where tapestries shimmer and incense smoulders lazily in a corner brazier. A young boy sits cross-legged on a pillow, a book in his lap. Watching him closely, watching everyone closely, is a woman seated just behind him. Not veiled, not silent. She's alert, composed. Her name? No one says it aloud. They call her Valide, Mother. She wasn't born in this palace. She was bought, trained, summoned, chosen, and then she gave birth to the future. The Ottoman Empire wasn't the only Islamic power where concubines became mothers to kings, but they took it to an art form. Unlike some previous dynasties, the Ottomans rarely married. Why? Because marriage brought political alliances and divided loyalties. Concubines, on the other hand, were loyal only to the Sultan, and more importantly, to their children. It sounds strategic. It was strategic. Mainstream history sometimes calls it the harem system. But what it really was? A pipeline, from enslaved girl to power broker, if you could survive the gauntlet. You walk past portraits now. Not of sultans, but of the women behind them. Some of them ruled empires without ever sitting on a throne. Like Kusum Sultan or Hurrem Sultan, both once slaves. Both mothers of sultans. Both ruthless, brilliant, and often more politically savvy than the men they advised. Historians still argue whether these women had real agency or just proximity to it. But their fingerprints are everywhere, on letters, treaties, reforms, and deaths that changed the course of empires. You enter a chamber where eunuchs bow deeply to an elderly woman in emerald silk. She doesn't smile. She doesn't speak. But one look from her, and a vizier rethinks his entire argument. This is not someone who waits to be asked. Her son is away at battle. She's holding court in his name. Quietly. Unofficially. Effectively. A fringe detail. Many of these concubine-turned-queen mothers secretly patronised artists, poets, and scholars. Some funded public fountains, schools, and mosques. One Valid Sultan even ran a shadow diplomacy network, exchanging letters with European queens under fake names. But power always came with a knife's edge. These women could be elevated one day and executed the next. If their son died, or was overthrown, they were often sent to the Old Palace, a genteel name for exile. Some never left those rooms again. You step inside one such place now. Faded silks, cracked tiles. A woman with silver hair stares out a window that hasn't opened in years. "I gave the Empire its lion," she says softly. "And they locked me in a cage." Sevens. You walk away slowly. Not all left legacies in gold. Some passed down pain. Their sons became tyrants, traumatized by palace intrigue. Raised without fathers, manipulated by mothers, they often grew up surrounded by paranoia. One sultan reportedly had 19 brothers strangled to secure his throne. The mothers? Some cried, some didn't. And yet, many of these women tried to protect their children. They navigated court politics like chess masters, outwitting viziers, silencing rivals, and forging alliances, all without leaving the palace walls. You see a scribbled family tree on a parchment in the archives. Most branches are male, but if you trace back carefully, nearly every powerful sultan had a mother who came from nowhere, a place unrecorded, a name erased, a price once paid in silver or silk. One poem reads, Sevens, born without title, raised without past. Sevens, she carved an empire from shadows cast. You walk into a mosque built by a Valid sultan, ornate, magnificent. Her name is etched in gold above the entrance, but not her origin. That part was scrubbed. No one wants to admit a slave built this. You sit beside a fountain she commissioned. A child dips his hand in the water, unaware of the history flowing under his feet. Historians still debate the ethics of their power. Were they victims who seized control, or collaborators who upheld the system? But you know now that those aren't opposites. They're reflections in the same gilded mirror. One young man polishing the tilework mutters, every sultan has two mothers, the one who bore him, and the empire that devours him. You write that down. As night falls, you walk through another palace wing. This one's silent, sealed. Inside are portraits never labelled, diaries never published. These were the ones who didn't bear children, who didn't rise, who faded into velvet wallpaper. But one name sticks. Halim. You found it etched under a servant's table. Just that. Her name and a date. No title. No story. Just proof she existed. You whisper it once as you leave, just in case someone's listening. You step into light. Not metaphorical light. Sunlight, sharp and golden, reflecting off white stone and orange tiles. Birds chirp from garden walls, fountains gurgle beside trimmed hedges, and somewhere a lute plays softly under a fig tree. You've arrived in Al-Andalus, Islamic Spain. Cordoba, Granada, Seville. Cities that still shimmer in memory as places of tolerance, intellect, and cultural symbiosis. Jews, Christians, and Muslims living side by side. That's the story you've probably heard. And to a degree, it's true. But you already know the drill by now. Scratch the beauty, and the cracks show. Because yes, Al-Andalus was brilliant. Libraries with thousands of volumes. Medical advancements that put the rest of Europe to shame. Music, architecture, poetry, mathematics. It was a marvel. But the idea that it was a utopia, that falls apart the moment you follow the servants through the back door. You pass into a courtyard where a scholar debates the origin of the soul with a Christian visitor. It's refined, even warm. They toast pomegranate juice and quote Aristotle. Just behind them, a slave clears the table. Like everywhere else, slavery was baked into the empire's bones here too, present, accepted, and sanitized by cultural brilliance. You trail a group of young girls entering a wealthy merchant's home. They were taken from Christian villages in the north, raided, purchased, or gifted during border conflicts. They're being taught Arabic, posture, how to pour wine without spilling a drop. The merchant's wife calls it charity. They'll live better here than in their old huts. You keep hearing that line. Mainstream portrayals of Al-Andalus often skip this part. The gardens, the architecture, the coexistence, they're emphasised. The servants in the shadows, not so much. You pass a church that's been converted into a mosque. The imam gives a sermon about justice. Just outside, a slave boy stands fanning him, barefoot. You speak with an older woman who once served in a sultan's household. She's now technically free, but still lives in the servant quarter. "Where would I go?" she says. "I only know these floors." Her voice is flat. She's not complaining. She's stating a fact. One fringe detail. Some elite Andalusi households trained slaves in music and poetry, not just for entertainment, but to show off at parties. "My servant can recite Rumi and play the oud," one man brags. Like owning a talking bird. You walk through the famed gardens of Madinat al-Zahra, roses in bloom, fountains cascading, marble glowing in the sun. It's breathtaking. But you notice something. The girl cleaning tiles, bent at the waist, never looking up. Her sleeves are soaked. Her face is blank. The garden wasn't made for her. She just keeps it alive. You overhear a nobleman discussing his Christian slave. "He's converted now," he says proudly. "Much more obedient." You ask if he'll free him. The man laughs. Historians still argue whether Al-Andalus was more humane in its enslavement practices. And yes, it's true that some slaves here gained education, were able to own property, and even rise in status. But those were the exceptions. For most, life was labour and silence. One poet wrote, "Sevens, you praise the stars in your house of light. Sneeze, but the hands that polish the floor are bruised. You find that verse scratched into a stairwell behind a Cordoban mansion. No attribution, just there. Some Jews and Christians here flourished under Muslim rule, became viziers, doctors, architects. But others were taxed into desperation. Some sold children to pay off jizya. Some lost property after conversions. And many were enslaved during wars, border raids, or crackdowns. You visit a hammam, a public bath. Slaves work behind the scenes, keeping water boiling, scrubbing walls. One girl rubs ash on the floor to soak up the oil. She hums. The same tune over and over. Maybe it's all she remembers. Later, at a dinner gathering, a visiting scholar praises Andalusian tolerance. "No one is forced to convert," he says. Then he brags about a harem girl who recited Hafiz to him under the stars. "A Christian," he adds, like a flourish. "But clever." Sevens. You don't eat. You just watch. The line between tolerance and domination here is thin. It's true that Al-Andalus allowed more diversity than many European kingdoms, but diversity isn't the same as equity, or dignity, or safety. You find a slave registry in the governor's archive, names, origins, sale prices, rolls. Some crossed out with ink, some marked returned, some labelled gifted to Granada. Human beings catalogued like fruit baskets. One fringe rumour you hear in the markets. A young Christian woman once escaped from a nobleman's estate disguised as a Sufi dervish. She wandered through mountain villages for years, preaching peace. Some say she was caught. Others say she was buried as a saint. History forgot to choose. As night falls, you sit at the edge of a reflecting pool in Alhambra. The walls around you shimmer with sacred geometry. It's stunning. But all you can think about is the boy who cleaned the mirror-polished floor, whose face no one ever painted. The sound of pages turning echoes around you now, soft, deliberate, precise. You're in a study this time. No gold-leaf ceilings or perfumed cushions. Just scrolls stacked to the ceiling, and one man hunched over a desk, quill scratching furiously. He's a scholar. Or he was? Now? He's property. You're about to witness a different kind of enslavement, one where knowledge doesn't protect you, and status is more fragile than glass in a sandstorm. His name was Al-Amin, at least. That's what he still signs at the bottom of his manuscripts. Once, he lectured in Damascus, wrote on astronomy, debated the divine with imams and foreign envoys. Then the vizier he served fell out of favour, and with him, so did everyone in his orbit. Accusations flew. Seditious speech, un-Islamic texts. undue influence on youth. His estate was seized, his family scattered, and Al-Amin sold at a private auction to the very man who used to quote his work during court dinners. You sit with him now as he copies legal commentaries by lamplight. He's precise, obedient, and mute unless spoken to. But in his margin notes, he writes messages. Tiny ones, like whispers tucked between the lines. You read one. My chains are lighter than my silence. Sevens. Mainstream narratives don't often include this. The idea that a man of learning, a contributor to the intellectual engine of the Caliphate, could be reduced to property overnight. But it happened, more than once, because under the Caliphates, political tides turned like sand in the wind. One day you're a court favourite. The next, you're a fugitive, a prisoner, or worse, a man with no name, no rights, and a price tag. You pass another man, once a poet. Now he grinds ink for his owner. You recognise his verse, quoted in mosques, etched on palace walls. He says nothing when you pass. One fringe detail. Some owners collected intellectuals the way others collected porcelain or horses. A brilliant scholar, enslaved, made your court look more prestigious. It wasn't education, it was trophy hunting. Historians still argue whether the enslavement of scholars was political punishment or collateral damage. Some argue these were rare, symbolic acts. Others insist it was a quiet strategy to neutralise dissent without drawing blood. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Silence. You visit a household where a mathematician teaches the children of the man who owns him. He does so with grace, clarity, even warmth. But when class ends, he returns to a servant's cell. His books are locked away at night. You ask one of the boys what the teacher used to do. He discovered stars, the boy says. Father says he belongs to us now. Sevens. There's a ledger on the wall, monthly duties, salaries for hired staff. The teacher isn't listed. He doesn't exist on paper. You walk through a small archive, guided by a man who used to manage an entire university library. Now, he dusts scrolls. He isn't allowed to read them. But sometimes, when no one's looking, he does anyway. He shows you a corner where he hides poems. Nothing radical. Just laments. The ink that once freed me now stains my chains. Sevens. There's one scholar who almost escaped. A woman, yes, they existed. She taught calligraphy in Basra, instructed the daughters of elite families. When her patron died, his son forgot the manumission promise and sold her to a rival house. She vanished from records after that. No more signatures. Just a sudden absence in the chain of transmission. You hear about her in whispers. Some say her students still recite her verses in secret. Some say her grave has no name, just a quill carved into stone. And here's the haunting truth. Education didn't protect you from the system. It often put a target on your back. The smarter you were, the more threatening you seemed. A caliph once said, "I fear a man who thinks more than one who fights." His viziers laughed. You wonder if they meant to. One merchant tells you about the day he bought a legal scholar. He knows every madhab, and the merchant boasts. Better than my imam. But I only bring him out during feasts. You ask why. Guests love hearing him debate theology between courses. Like entertainment. You press him further. Sos, would you free him? Sevens? He frowns. And lose the only man in Baghdad who can recite Ghazali while explaining astrology? He shakes his head, pours more wine. Too valuable. Sevens. You sit later with Al-Amin again. He's tired. His hands are shaking. But still, he copies. Always copies. You ask if he regrets it, all the thinking, the writing, the words that led him here. He looks up, eyes dull but still sparking in some unreachable corner. No, he says, because someday someone will read what I wrote, and they'll know I lived twice, once in chains and once in ink. The road is quieter now, not because the past has run out of stories, but because you've reached the edge of them, where memory frays and recent history begins. You walk under satellite dishes and minarets, between cell towers and camel trails. The call to prayer still rings out, but so does traffic. You're in the present, but the echoes are loud. You find yourself in a migrant camp somewhere near the Gulf, where men sleep 6 to a room and pass their passports to their sponsors upon arrival. They dig foundations for skyscrapers, sweep marble floors they'll never walk as guests. No chains, but no exit, either. This isn't ancient history. This is now. And you can't help but notice how familiar it all feels. The systems of slavery under Islamic caliphates didn't vanish. They morphed, changed shape. Today they show up in different clothes, legal loopholes, visa systems, recruitment fees, silence enforced by debt. You meet a man named Hadi. He came from East Africa to work construction. His recruiter promised good wages, food, and housing. Now his passport is locked in a drawer, his wages are withheld, and the guards at the labour camp carry sticks. He says softly, "I am not a slave," but then adds, "But I'm not free, either." Sevens. Modern historians and activists still argue whether to call this slavery or just exploitation. Legally, they differ. Lived reality, not so much. You visit a wealthy compound where a maid from Indonesia irons clothes in a marble-floored kitchen. Her phone is locked in her employer's drawer. She hasn't seen her children in 4 years. Her contract was written in a language she never learned to read. One fringe detail. In some countries, employers still refer to domestic workers as abdi behind closed doors. The same word used for slave. The same word used centuries ago. You ask one woman what freedom would look like. She laughs. 1 day off a week, she says. That would be paradise. Sevens. You see teenage boys working in textile shops under forged papers. You see girls adopted as house helpers and never paid. You see contract workers who can't leave without permission. You see silence. And in courtrooms, there are still cases where employers are fined for mistreatment, but rarely jailed. Compensation is awarded, yes, but the damage runs deeper than coins can fix. In some regions, anti-slavery laws exist, on paper, but enforcement, rare. And often, slaves don't come forward because they don't believe anyone will help them, or because the fear runs deeper than memory. You find an imam preaching on Friday about compassion. He quotes the Prophet's words on treating servants with dignity. After the sermon, he returns to his villa. His maid stands barefoot in the sun, holding his sandals. You ask her name. She gives it, then quickly adds, "Please don't use it." Sevens. This isn't a story about Islam failing. It's about people failing, hiding behind systems, sacred texts, and bureaucracy, the same way they did 1,000 years ago. You revisit a museum where the glories of the Islamic Golden Age are proudly displayed: astronomy, architecture, medicine, but nowhere do you see a plaque that says, "This was built on forced labour." Sevens. The records of slave markets are locked away in dusty archives. The journals of concubines never made it to the display cases. The names of household servants never made it to marble. But their fingerprints. Everywhere. You walk past a palace now turned hotel. There's a banquet inside. A woman in heels snaps her fingers for a glass of water. A maid nods and disappears behind a curtain. You've seen that curtain before. It's the same one, just newer fabric. Historians still argue how to tell this story. Do we highlight the mercy within Islamic slavery, or do we spotlight the cruelty? Do we weigh the spiritual context or the physical cost? You stop asking, because you've seen enough to know that every chain has a shadow, and some shadows stretch across centuries. At the end of your walk, you find a mural, faded but clear. It shows a woman with her eyes covered, a child pulling at her robe, a man behind her holding a key. Underneath, someone scrawled in red, "We are still waiting." You step back. You breathe. And then, slowly, you sit. Because this part of the story isn't about running anymore. It's about remembering. The sounds soften now. The bustling markets, the cries of the salt fields, the whispers in the palace, fading like echoes at the bottom of a deep, long well. You've walked a road most won't. You've seen what lies beneath the golden domes and perfect calligraphy. You've traced the stories of those whose lives didn't make it into poetry. But now it's time to rest. Let your breath slow. Let the dust settle. The chains are gone from your feet, but their weight still lingers in your thoughts. That's okay. History doesn't ask you to fix it, only to remember it, to hold space for the lives that slipped between margins, the names that were erased, and the truths hidden behind silk curtains and minarets. Maybe tomorrow, the stories will hit differently. Maybe you'll spot an echo in the world around you, in a contract, a uniform, a too-silent room. And maybe then, you'll see the line that runs from then to now, and from now into whatever comes next. But for tonight, you've carried enough. Let the hum of a fan or the breeze through your window carry you gently back to the present. Let your muscles go soft. Let your eyes drift closed. You've heard the voices. You've borne witness. And now, you can sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.